Today we read from the book of Esther, chapter 4, verse 14. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to this kingdom for such a time as this. This is the reading of the word.
Thanks be to God.
Okay, let's try that again. This is the reading of the word.
Thanks be to God.
For ought we not be thankful when we hear God's word in and through our lives, and when we recognize that we are exactly where we need to be at this exact moment in time, doing just as we ought to be doing. That's powerful thought process, right? If you look at the thought that you are exactly where you need to be, you might not feel like it. Oh man. Some of us are going, okay, if this is what you got in mind for me, God, why? Please. Why? You see, the story of Esther has always been one of my favorites, perhaps because there are only two books of Scripture that are named for women, Ruth and Esther. That's it. That's all you got. And Esther was not older. Ruth had already been married and life had happened. A lot of things had gone on. So she was an older, although young adult. Esther is generally considered to be around the ages of anywhere from 14 to 18. Esther, the story of Esther happens during the Babylonian exile that occurred. Remember the upper kingdom and the lower kingdom, the northern and the southern kingdoms, Jerusalem in the middle. When the kingdoms split, the northern kingdom was overtaken, and then the southern kingdom was overtaken. Jerusalem fell. When that happened, they divided the people. The ruling groups and the priest class were exiled to Babylon. Those that remained became what we understand in Scripture to be known as the Samaritans. Because after this exile, after the time of Esther, because the book of Esther happens during Babylonian exile occurred, Babylon was overtaken by Persia. Y'all, am I catching you up on your history lesson, or are you going, please don't? You have to know when it takes place in order to understand why the story is so significant. Otherwise, it's just another beautiful story in our Scripture. It's kind of like if we didn't understand that Moses' life occurred after all the wonderful little Hebrew children had been slaughtered so that they could not continue to repopulate and overtake the Egyptians. You have to know when it happens. So Esther occurs during the Persian Empire, and during the Persian Empire, those that were in Babylon who were Jews were able to now go back to Jerusalem. But Esther's family had stayed. Esther was considered an orphan. She had her uncle. His name was Mordecai. He was a scribe. And during this time, the Persian king's wife, first wife, Vashti, was set aside, and so he searches for a new wife, and Esther ends up being that woman. Long story short, right? So Esther is suddenly the wife of the Persian king. The king had an advisor who wanted to do away with the Jews. And so, that's where we enter into the story with this verse. Because Mordecai was asking Esther to go in front of the king, which was an offense punishable by instant beheading. Yay. And not allowed, particularly for a woman. And he's asking her to do this, to speak up for her people. For such a time as this. I don't think we're put into that sort of extreme circumstance in our lives, are we? I mean, it might be considered rude to interrupt someone in the middle of something, but generally, unless it's a judge in court, which I really don't recommend that, you're not going to lose your life to speak up, to speak out. I think often, though, too, we in living our lives wonder, what is our purpose? Isn't that one of the great questions? Why are we here? What's the point? I think the older we get, the more we realize that there is a point. We just didn't know it when we were younger. Would we be the same people we are today without everything that we've experienced previously? You don't have to think about it. The answer is no. That doesn't mean that those circumstances are not going to be difficult or painful or life-altering in multiple and countless ways. I mean, Esther is sitting here hiding her identity as a Jewish woman in order to survive. We don't have to hide our identities, but there are a lot of points in time in our lives where all we're doing is focused on survival. We can't consider all of the other things that are going on around us, or even other people's lives going on around us, because we are a tunnel vision on, I just got to get to the next day. And yet we have to consider, when we look around and when we think of what we've gone through, how often do we pull back on those things and say, man, let me tell you about this time. Because we're often able to give advice to others based on our own experiences. We like doing that, don't we? You all do. I'm going to let you know you like doing that. to say, you know what? I've been through some of what you're going through. Let me show you, tell you how God was present in it and how I've come out on the other side. That's not easy when you're in the midst of something. But when you're on the other side, it's fantastic. Every summer I can tell kids about the time that I didn't date up until I met Chad. Ugh, that was bad. That's not a good example. Never mind. You know, but I can tell that because I'm on the other side, right? Good, better, and different. For those that have been through divorce or for times of deep illness, have been in the hospital, those who have lost children, we all have these experiences that we can pull on and pull from. But I'll have to admit that I'm sure when Esther heard those words that, oh, perhaps you were created for such a time as this, I'm sure she went, thanks, Uncle Mordecai. What do I get to do with this? We don't recognize often the impact that we have while we're in that moment. You can't recognize the influence you have on any particular day. Because you're in the midst. But when we live as people of faith, according to the calling of God on our hearts and on our minds, when we live the love of God in and through each and every day, then we're prepared for every single time, every single moment. We're prepared, and so others can see that we are there for the times that we are in. You might not know that you were the one who influenced someone's prayer because they saw what you went through. And you became someone who they could say, oh, they did it, so I can too. You might not never, ever hear that either. Because we really also stink kind of at saying, oh, you know what? You helped me through this. I don't think you know how. But each and every one of us had people in our lives that we influenced day in and day out by our very presence. Whether we recognize the power of that presence or not. For we are the people we are created to be for such a time as this time, this moment, and this day. We're really, really conscious of it when we're young. We forget about that as much when we're old, right? We forget how much influence we have and are in others' lives. Yet I want you to consider, as I look out in this room, the beautiful presence of people who sing. The constancy of sending out cards, making phone calls, making meals for those who are in need, for trimming trees, for mowing the yard, for taking care of the van, for of doing all of those things. You were created for that. And you know who sees it? Whether you realize it or not. Others. We're our own harshest critic, aren't we? Ooh. We always think we're not doing enough, good enough. We're not meeting the needs of others. We're too tired. We're not, we're just not whatever, filling your personal blank. And if there is anything that the story of Esther tells us, it is that you are enough. Your presence is valuable beyond measure. You have an impact far-reaching beyond your own. We're sitting in a space created by those who made this in order for those that came after them to be present. Does that make any sense? When you vision the beginning of a church, they envision a building and they envision it lasting for a really, really long time, right? Hopefully. They picture people and they picture all of the ministry and the stuff that happens, and yet, the very first signature on our charter was from an almost 80-year-old woman, Mrs. Hooker, who the church is named for. She had also signed the charter of 8th Street Christian Church. And so her name was on two church charters. That was the beauty of that. And she knew coming in that she would not be here much longer, and yet here we stand, right? As we've been making choices, very conscious choices in the revamp of the fellowship hall, it's always been with the question of, what will this look like 5 years, 10 years, 15 years down the road? We forget that we are here in a time in which we have immeasurable value and worth, because this time influences the next. Who we are influences people in countless ways. My hope and my challenge for you all is that as you live out your testimony of faith, that you live in the presence of today. That you see God in your life today so that others can see God in your life today. Because Esther didn't know what time it would be, right? And neither do we. Amen.